when did you know that you wanted to be a historian?
Oh, I guess through my education system, especially maybe at the high school level, that I found an interest in doing various historical activities, sources, and things. But the place I really began to commit myself to history study was as an undergraduate, and working through an undergraduate program in which I worked with some very good professors who exposed me not only to history, but more so Asian history in ways that I had not had previously. The time itself was really very critical, too, because this was at the period of the Vietnam War and American times. And there were really no scholars, or limited numbers of scholars, let's say, who had committed themselves to Asia, but especially to Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So, consequent to this, as an undergraduate, I had the opportunity to go to graduate school largely because they were looking for people then to commit themselves to doing a study of Southeast Asia, and it all seemed to work out for me in the process of doing so in time. But I really started my career in graduate school then doing work on Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. But at the same time, I came into contact with a professor who was doing South Asia, and I wound up doing a double program then, doing South Asia and Southeast Asia at the master's degree level, and then went on to the University of Michigan, predominantly because they gave me the opportunity to follow up on what I'd been doing at the master's level, and doing this joint study then of largely Chola South India, early South Indian history, as it paired then with early Southeast Asian history in place. So it was a sort of nice partnership that was there. But once again, I would emphasize that this was a period in time in which in America there had not been much commitment then to studying Asia and Southeast Asia, and some of South Asia in particular.
Thank you. The second question is, you have researched on early military activities in Southeast Asia. So how these developments can be related to the region, what we call in Bangladesh actually?
Military engagements of the present, you mean, in terms of the historical past? A lot of it has to do with post-colonial and developments that really drive out of the colonial period here. Was geography inequities. Bangladesh in particular was sort of, if you want to look at it under British India, an appendage. I don't know if you agree on that, but that's sort of the way I see it a bit in this instance. That most of the interest was in the, let's say, Bengal proper. And the area that was here was populated by downriver populations, and people use the term tribal, but not in a derogatory manner in this case. But again, people of various social backgrounds and historical backgrounds that were here just because of the nature of the geography of what is Bangladesh here. But again, under British rule, as I would see this, it was not given as much emphasis in terms of engagement or trying to develop the region under the British, let's say, as might have been the case otherwise here. So that your independence, then it was a matter of creating, well, at independence, you were a part then of Pakistan and then Bangladesh at that point in time. And as a historian, I would look at this as a problem because you had then the Pakistani area that was largely a group of very powerful and well-networked financially and otherwise groups that were very much a part of that British colonial administration, and where Bangladesh didn't have that sort of clout, let's say, in terms of connective, as I look at that historically. And ultimately, the end consequence of this was your need to sever that connection to give yourself an identity. But you didn't have the infrastructure, as I would argue that let's say, a Pakistan did. And also, as I began my answers to you, the problem of multi-ethnicity, multicultural traditions that you have here that are very complex. as opposed to, let's say, Pakistan, which has had a consequence in the more recent past of multi-ethnicities and the problems there. But it's something it's much more complicated than what you face here, or have faced in the process. So I think that even now, one of the major problems Bangladesh has is the issue of identity that you see, not only in terms of your country, but also trying to locate yourself in the wider Bengal region, as we've been discussing this today, in place here. And as you look at this in the wider context of the Bengal, as I'm going in this direction, you're up against the South Asia issue that is there relative to the contributions historically to the Bengal. You're dealing with your neighbors in other directions, where Myanmar is a country that has a long, strong heritage in terms of regionalities. Thailand coming down the line is what it is. Malaysia did have multi-ethnic type of issues, but a very different sort of scenario than what you have had in terms of that multi-ethnicity. But even in the case of Malaysia, there's a problem today of the difference between West Coast Malaysia and East Coast Malaysia, where in East Coast Malaysia you have equal issues then of identity of crisis that is there as opposed to the other, and with equal problems that they're facing, maybe not as complex as what you have, but again, they are there as we look at that.
Sir, what we are seeing in South Asia, Southeast Asia, if you look at the SAARC or if you look at the BIMSTEC, they cannot prosper like the ASEAN or like European community just for regional cooperation. Do you think that historically this region is disintegrated for regional integration or regional cooperation?
I think you begin to answer that question by what we were just talking about. I think you need to create your own identity here. And I'm not sure that Bangladesh is, at this point in time, clear in their identity. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but think about that for a moment. And I raised the issue of the multi-ethnicities that you have here and the problems that derive from that. But I think that there is a sense of nationalism, but you're working on that sense of nationalism here. And again, part of that is drawing together as a nation that becomes a solid foundation then for your future. But you have, again, under the British, not a clear assertion then or infrastructure then of these identities, and you're still sort of working these out. And just the diversity of regionalities that you have and components you're working on them, let's say. Look at the difference between what you see in the coastal zone where we are right now as opposed to that of the upstream. And as I did my presentation today, remember I talked about the upstream-downstream relationships? Apply that model that I was talking about to your existence that is here, of the coast, the sort of downstream behind the coast, which is, from your perspective, fairly stable, I would think here. And again, I'm touching in your history, and you probably know this much more than I do here. But then look at your upstream, which engages, in this case, areas that are still just evolving from a more tribal existence and characterizations that are here that come out of this, and diversities and identities that in most cases are just in a regional identity stage as opposed to that of locking into a broader sense of nationalism that is here.
No, do you think, sir, any prospect or opportunity in regionalism in this region actually? Because in SAARC we say that this is because of the rivalry between India and Pakistan. But in BIMSTEC there is no Pakistan.
No, there isn't here. I've had a direct relationship in some of this because when I was here in 2002, I developed a relationship with an academic who is engaged in one of the upstream tribal regions, in this case, has been working heavily in developing the educational base in this instance. And a lot of this is, even from his position, trying to establish a credibility of the education system as a grounding, and even a grounding of what that education is in place. And we've corresponded a little bit over time with the evolution of this. But one of the things that he's done, above all else, is try to assert then a sense of identity within that region and as a common educational base then to help reinforce that, and having projections then of moving beyond where they are economically and as a region into something that provides then other alternatives. And in his case, heavily focusing upon developing a quality education system that would be a part of this and the identities that derive from that. I'm not as cognizant of your education system, but as I see this, I think that what you do have here is a functional education system that is down in this more sort of downstream area here. but look at the rest of your country then, whether, again, once you begin to move up into those areas, whether there's an equity that is there in the process. But how in the process of bringing in those other groups to the nation, how that can really be broadened then into a larger discussion then of nationalism that is here.
So do you see any prospect for Bangladesh in the way of Bengal of this reason? And how do you define this prospect?
Part of this is defining yourself as a starting point here and beginning to walk together. I think that what I've seen here, since I have not been here since 2002, is a lot of infrastructure development that was not here in 2002 when I was here. I see a lot of building projects that are here. I have been told and haven't seen a whole lot of this, but you now have new factory systems that are here that are rather different than they were in 2002, where you had these sort of old shells that were there, and where you're actually developing then, let's say, more modern factory systems that are here, and really developed a market for yourself in terms of textile production as a grounding that is here for prosperity, and beginning to build from that, hopefully, and diversifying some of the things you can do as a nation, maybe developing your own infrastructure of diversity of economic consumption yourself in certain ways that would be part of this, of relying that as opposed to relying exclusively on exports, and some integrity that is there of developing, again, the sense of nationalism I was talking about. But things are progressing right now, and I've seen some very good things in the limited time I've been here, but much more building and much more transition to a more stable urban environment at the core than what I saw in 2002 in place. So just start at this. What has happened to Dhaka in the last 15 years? Is it a better place? Yeah, you're not in your head. This time I'm recording this, but you're not in your head. Yes, right? So what has been successful in the case of Dhaka here? Of building a better sense of community in Dhaka, and how that can become an example of your own accomplishments then, as this begins to spread into the wider realm of the country itself in the process. Thailand is a case in point. Thailand was all centered in Bangkok as the core urban place that is here. And one of the things I've seen in their development then, as their industrial development is spreading this industrialization more up to the north a bit in this case. But they've done some infrastructure investment that is really interesting here, because they've built the factories, but they've also provided an infrastructure of providing transportation from people to not have them leave their home communities, but to allow them to commute then by buses provided by the corporation to bring them into work and take them back home in this, and providing some infrastructure in terms of educational development otherwise, that again is just not having the worker work for the wages in this case, but providing some commitment to the community and acculturate them in a way that they become then a permanent labor force for you that you can depend upon, as opposed to seeing this as more of a short-term type of thing and let's squeeze our money out of it at this point, but developing, again, the sense of an integrated type of whole that is here that would go with this. And as I say, the Thai have done a pretty good job of this as your next-door neighbor in many ways here, of what seems to be working for them in good ways. The problem in Thailand is that their regionalism is also similar to yours, and the fact that you have the centeredness then in the Chao Phraya system of Bangkok, and largely a linkage then to a Chinese heritage that goes in the mixture of Thai and Chinese there, and the people then of northeast Thailand, that is mainly rural in this case, have been asserting then their desire then to have a voice in the politics that they haven't been given adequately, let's say here, and different cultural traditions that they're actually trying to defend in the process of this. And that becomes then a problematic in terms of Thai politics of working out some sort of appropriate linkage so that everyone doesn't become then a Bangkok Thai, as opposed to seeing a broader diversity of definition of being Thai here in space. So, I mean, that's your next-door neighbor that you're looking at here, where Thailand seems to be a success, but the current political situation there says otherwise. If you go out into southern Thailand, likewise, a lot of the problems down there in terms of Islamic separatism in the recent past have been dissipated largely there. And a lot of it's been done because the Patani area and otherwise has seen a lot of economic investment there. It's really then negated a lot of the problems that were there in the past. They've also established a very good university there in that region that becomes a hub then for them, the education of a new generation to begin to fill these slots and not have people coming in as much from the outside, but having talent within the region to build then a regionality that is there, that is viable in the process of doing so. But again, that's the case of your next door neighbor that you might look at a little bit in terms of some potentials that might be there. I remember going to the Patani region when I was a graduate student and doing my first trips down there, and I didn't go there particularly because I was warned that there was Islamic extremism that was in that area, and it'd be very dangerous for me to do that. I went back there about 15 years later to give a guest lecture at that new Patani University system, and just a remarkable change that had taken place in the process, and expansionism and stabilities that have gone with that. So it can be done. Yeah, it can be done in this case. But it's a matter of beginning to have some degree of plan and consensus that begins to take place here. Cooperation, really beginning to identify the problems in the infrastructure, let's say, and beginning to kind of itemize these things and beginning to work out plans to deal with the infrastructure problems that are there, which are there.
One of the major problems, infrastructure, do you think?
Well, that's what I'm saying in this case, and especially that begins with the issue then of multiculturalism. That you have multi-ethnicity, multiculturalism, religiosities, inequitable education systems, just a whole lot of infrastructure development. But I think the Thai have probably been very successful at this. On the other hand, some of the success has been in the process of also defending your own identity, and that's particularly the case in northeast Thailand right now, that you see a lot. They're mainly agriculture out there, but they have some other things going that is different than what you see in this rapid urbanization and industrial expansionism that's Bangkok right now, and there is adjacent, and with the spread effect of this equally, as I say, into the Patani region of southern Thailand, which is really going through a lot of transition too. I mean, Malaysia, for that matter. There's a real difference between West Coast Malaysia and East Coast Malaysia.
Yes.
And just look at the problematics that are created out of that. We see. So it isn't just you here. This, as you're looking at this idea of shared identities in the Bay of Bengal community, I mean, there are common grounds that are here, and you need to kind of identify these as regional problems potentially and kind of begin to work at them as a united whole, in which some people have resources, others don't, but the point of this is seeing this as an end product. And I think that that's what's happening in ASEAN right now, from being a part of ASEAN, that they are beginning to see these common problems that are there that need to be resolved as a whole. I've been working out of Singapore, and one of the things that is helping them is, again, the role of Singapore is playing that intermediary role that is there. There's self-interest in it, too. But
do you think here Bangladesh can play the same role that Singapore played? Because Bangladesh is the geographical location of the bridge between the Southeast and Southeast.
I think you could here. I see some progress taking place here, more than I expected, to be perfectly honest, in terms of what I'm seeing here. But I think that, yeah, that's something you could develop. Look at where Singapore was in the 1960s, and look at where they are now. Because they pride themselves in what they've accomplished, which is largely, back in 1965, they were more or less what Bangladesh was back then. And look where they are right now, which is largely through an assertion then of identity. There were some costs that went with that, and largely that of a very powerful central government under Lee Kuan Yew that you see. And there were costs that were there that went with that. I'm not sure that you would get away with that, at least in terms of how that was done. But what you can do is look at, again, the institutional developments that took place in Singapore in detail, and beginning to see how you might replicate some of that institutional development. One of those, as I began my comments, was educationally. And that was the first investment that you had in Singapore, was a really first-rate education system. And with smacks of nationalism along the way as well. But it's there. But you need to have a commitment. But ultimately, the end product that Singapore has had is a sense of citizenship and commitment that has come out of that. And I'm not sure you do at this point in time, do you? Again, I'm projecting this, and you can't answer on the tape that is here that we're doing. But again, something to think about is that creation of a unified citizenship And once again, my contact with one of your regions in this case is, even in this case, developing a regional identity that becomes a predecessor then to that of the national identity that might come out of it here.
Previous discussion, you have discussed regarding the documenting of 1500th century. So the integration of previous will be beneficial for BIMSTEC futures or something like that? What do you think?
I think that there's some real good things that come out of this. I basically went to Myanmar, and my first trip to Myanmar was having to go there on a 6-day visa and do training, traveling in there, and being under that threat of a weak transportation infrastructure and other things, but I was able to get to Bagan in the process and see that and come back and see a lot of the country along the way. But that was about my own initiatives, but just again, how they've progressed significantly in terms of their infrastructures that are there in ways that maybe we didn't expect either here. But I've seen the development of an educational infrastructure in the region, which is very good now and progressive, as you see. The Thai have a very good education system in place. Malaysia has had some problems in their education system in the split of the secular and the religious systems, and how that's sort of been a problem in terms of the quality, overall quality of the education system in the process, where Malaysia used to be the top dog in terms of education in the region. It's sort of moved away from that position now. Myanmar seems to be developing a better education system than what they've had in the past. And there is a case that the Buddhist church has been an important part of that transition in terms of education. And they seem to be, at least in a dialogue of a mutual acceptance that is here, and equally bringing into that discussion the Chinese community too in terms of what they're doing in Myanmar. Cambodia, I taught there for a period of time. Cambodia, trying to develop a national curriculum has been a problem for them. They've done a good job of moving beyond the Khmer Rouge legacy and moving into things. There's a rapid development there without the adequate educational infrastructure to provide the quality type of things that are there. And right now, because of that lack of quality education, there are some limits on what they can accomplish there. And mainly it's a matter of having a common commitment, let's say, to educational structure for the future and what needs to be done in that. And I've worked at the ministry level in Cambodia, and there's some real issues there in terms of bringing this together as a whole that we see in Cambodia. Indonesia has done a really pretty good job of developing a quality education system over time. There's some problems today within it in terms of inequities economically and some other things in terms of regionalities that are there, but overall they do have a national education system that seems to be working. and the ability to then have people moving into the collegiate system as there's a college infrastructure that they've developed there too, which is a combination of public and private that is there. Vietnam has done very well for itself, I think. I've taught in the Vietnam institutions. I think that the state's commitment to Doi Moi in Vietnam and the education things that are there are an important part of the variable. The education system is heavily focused upon developing technological education infrastructure and equally committed to the use of English as a language of communication for the future and all that goes with that. Where again, they've made some commitments that are here. There's some assertions of inequities that are there in terms of place, but I think that they've made as much progress as anyone of really resolving was a total lack of a functional education system and really kind of moving very quickly into something like this in time. So there are examples within the region as we see this, and it's just a matter of, again, reaching some degree of mutual commitment with some targets that go. And once again, with my reinforcement of the idea of education is a good place to start with this, as we'll see.